Welcome, welcome. How are you doing this evening or this afternoon?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Very well, thank you. Tired after a long day's work, but it's only 3 o'clock, so got to keep going.
Nice to have you here. I've been a big fan of your published work and your interviews for a while now. So it's very good to have it culminate in actually getting to talk to you. So thank you again so much for gracing us here with your presence and your scholarship.
Oh no, thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll just want to give a brief introduction. So Jack Bull is a specialist on basically all things early Christianity, patristics, um, uh, the early eras, canon, apostolic fathers, and a whole bunch of different subjects related to that. He did his undergrad at St. Mary's University in 2016. He got his master's degree from King's College in 2018, and he's currently a PhD candidate under the auspicious Marcus Vincent, who is also one of the world's leading patristic scholars. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure. Auspicious indeed is Marcus Vincent.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, we just finished, like literally a couple days ago, just finished reading Marcion and the Dating of the Synoptic Gospels, and it was just like a roller coaster. Every single chapter, his writing style, the information he provides, the ease of understanding, and I think you speak in the same way that he writes, and that's what I really appreciate because there is a certain uh, a certain brand of scholarship that is like highly esoteric. We're now attempting to read orthodoxy and heresy, and we're getting a headache from that. So we appreciate definitely the way that you facilitate the information to lay readers and lay listeners. So yeah, so good evening to you and good morning and or good afternoon to you, good evening, good morning, good anything to everybody all over the world, all the audience members. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with a question that I'd like to ask of all the academics that join us here, and it's basically what intrigued you about this specific field of biblical studies? Because there are a lot of things, hermeneutics, theology, but textual criticism. But what interested you in studying this specific section of Christianity, namely, origins and things like that?
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, so I wanted to be an Egyptologist when I was a young man. I spent until I was about 17, and when I turned 17, I became a Protestant Christian. At which point, I decided that the only thing more interesting than Egypt and Abu Simbel and all the pharaohs and all those sorts of things was Christianity. And so I went to study my undergraduate, and during my undergraduate degree, I converted from a 5 point Calvinism to a very strict Roman Catholicism, which couldn't be a more drastic shift. Um, and so I then continued to pursue that further with a master's degree, which is where I met my now supervisor and never tell him, but hero, Marcus Vincent. Um, and one of the beautiful things that happened there was he taught me about Ignatius of Antioch, who is the subject of my PhD and who I study on a day to day basis. And the reason why I became Catholic was because of the writings of Ignatius. And so when I met Marcus, and I was sitting about 4 p.m. in a lecture in London, and he said to me, "You know that Ignatius guy? He didn't write all those letters, you know." And I was furious. I mean, it was beyond fury. I was so angry with him. And he gave me a copy of his yet to be published at that time book, Rewriting Early Christianity 2019, which I think he published with Cambridge. And I realized he was right, that Ignatius did not write some of the Ignatian epistles. And so that moved me from a place where I was interested just generically in theology and um, Roman Catholicism to a place where I needed to study the early Christianity movement, what their canon was in particular, because moving from a Protestant background, especially, what the canon is really matters. It matters too as a Catholic, but less so. Um, and when I realized that, or at least from my point of view, that early Christianity, the story I was told was probably not true, at least about how the canon was formed, it immediately became my interest to study it to work out how it happened. And so that was sort of the origins and the roots. And now, sort of 3 years into my PhD and maybe 8 years into study total, it still remains a complete mystery to me and to most scholars how the early canon was formed and the ins and outs of early Christianity. And I think that's one of the really sad things. Um, we might come on to this later, but one of the really sad things about scholarship at the moment, we've got a lot of scholars who keep saying the words "I know," and the big problem with "I know" when you're dealing with Christianity 2,000 years ago, with a lack of resources and sources and manuscript evidence and attestations, is that you probably don't know. Um, so yeah, my efforts at the moment are still put towards trying to find out rather than claiming absolute knowledge.
I mean, you kind of preempted all of my other questions with just your answer to the first one, which is amazing. My second one was going to be, people have um, certain ideas about their own traditions, whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism, anything that's based in antiquity. And sometimes they tend to be a little bit simplistic and a little bit, like picturesque, and like this quintessence of transmission all the way until our day. So a lot of Christians would think, the apostles got together, over tea or some snacks, and they wrote down the Gospels at around like 30 or 40, and then a bunch of evil Gnostics and heretics came around and tried to screw it all up. So my next question was going to say, like, because I've interviewed David Litwa, and I'm very familiar with your work. We just finished reading also a book on canon by Lee Martin McDonald, and it seems like it's a little bit more complex than that. Can you just kind of summarize what kind of struck you as a contrast from what you thought initially going in? Because I know you changed kind of your worldview completely, with regards to from Protestantism to Catholicism, and to now to kind of being more like open-minded and just going where the facts lead. But can you just summarize to us what was the biggest contrast for you after your studies as opposed to prior, before going in?
Yeah, I mean, I should emphasize to anyone who hears as well that I am still a committed Roman Catholic who attends the Latin Mass every week. I actually live currently in a Catholic church, partly for the free rent, but
Ooh,
also because I do some work for them. I do some work for them as well. But I think that one of the big problems we have as a people at the moment is, and this extends far wider than scholarship, is that everyone is so sure of what they believe that they have no room to discuss or debate. I heard a great interview with Russell Brand, not someone who I'm usually a big fan of, but he mentioned a quote from a director where he said, once we remove nuance from the discussion, we move towards authoritarianism. And I think that's so true. And so when I was a 21-year-old hot-headed young man, um, although I still look 21, um, I was so defensive every time you wanted to question me. Again, not just about religion, but if you wanted to say your politics was wrong, your religion was wrong, your view about football was wrong, I was always a man backed into a corner. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to say, no, you don't understand. When I then began to allow nuance into my life, that some things are not as they might seem, that's when I began to learn. And that's when I began to really understand things. That doesn't mean now that I don't hold strong beliefs. It doesn't mean that um, I just roll over every time someone says, Jack, you're wrong. But it does mean that when Marcus then comes to me, or Litwa, someone whose work I'm familiar with, comes to me and says, actually, maybe you could rethink that. I will, and I might come back to the same conclusion. But you've got to allow yourself the opportunity to rethink. Otherwise, it's a good sign you're part of a cult and not a sensible religion. With specific then to early Christianity and biblical literature, we were told as Protestants nothing. And I mean that. Like, literally nothing. I mean, outside of, well, everyone who wrote, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, James, John, etc., they wrote those letters, and as soon as they wrote those letters, they were canon. That was it. No discussion about how that happened, that process, or anything. I'm not an expert at all in Islam or anything like that, but Protestants have a very much a view of the the canon as if God or an angel very much just dictated it, and then that was it. Although obviously the Bible doesn't say that about itself, nor does any theologian say that about the Bible that's ever lived particularly. That's just what they think. And so when I was in my undergraduate degree, I met a fellow Catholic, and he said to me, "Look, you know, this view you have, there's no historical, theological, ecclesial reason for you to think this." And so I said, right, well, I'm going to show you. I'm going to read some of the early church fathers, and that's going to be it. And so I read Ignatius of Antioch, who clearly didn't have a canon. In fact, as I know now, probably didn't even know the canon, as particularly Paul, and also the Gospels, which I think are also second century. And so, again, I then had to allow myself for the first time to rework and consider what was going on in my brain. And rather than being attacked, or felt like I was being attacked, sorry, I didn't even have any way to defend because the evidence was so demonstrably true. I couldn't even defend, so I couldn't feel attacked because I just had to sort of concede. And that again happened with then the dating of early Christian texts, and it began first of all with the Gospel of Luke, which to me, even before I read anyone's work on Marcion, Jason Bodun, Matthias Klinghardt, and Marcus, it was clear to me that Luke was a interpolation of Marcion. And if we know that Marcion doesn't write between 130, or collate, I should say, probably, between 130 and 140, how can Luke be first century? How is it possible? Well, it isn't, unless we're time traveling. So, again, another really pivotal point in my early Christian studies, and also in my personal life. I had to wrestle with these things, and this is why when we talk about early Christianity to my Protestant and Catholic brothers and sisters, it's not just they get upset because it's not just a matter for them of academic intrigue and a theological endeavor. It's their lives. And I had to debate it with my fiance, who I'm marrying in 6 months. I had to talk to her about it and say, look, I'm struggling with this. This is difficult. Yeah, and I had to go to my priest and say, look, I'm struggling with this. And both of them, bless their hearts, are not theologically trained. So then you also get real no bloody help from them. But again, like I say, that when we, as that quote says, if we remove nuance, then I think we're in a really dangerous place, and that doesn't matter what the subject or the field. But I think it is one that scholarship has fallen into on every side, and that's a problem for us.
Yeah, it's amazing how similar our perspectives are. I mean, I'm probably older than you. You're much 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 smarter and more. But like that's exactly how I got into this because I was watching an interview one time with Steve Mason, and he
Mm.
was describing like the Josephine influence on Luke. Before I knew anything about apostolic attestation or the reception of the Gospels in early or anything like that, before I even started reading any books. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting. It seems. And then I came across the Westar Institute, and I'm also a member of Bart Ehrman's blog. So I asked him a few questions on there. I don't really want to disclose what he said because it's kind of yeah, neither here nor there. But I saw him in an interview, and the same channel that you were on, History Valley, and they asked him, "Are you open to a dating for Luke, possibly in the second century?" And he said, yeah, I'm open to it. But the question is, what do you do with all of those apostolic father references of Luke? And I said, oh, that's probably why they dated into the first century. So I went into a Catholic database to try to find all of these quotations of Luke, and I honestly could not find one. They're always like ambiguous. One of them was somehow appealing to First Timothy, and it was just Ignatius, I think in Magnesians or something like that, saying, "Don't forget to pray." And the Greek was like one word or something like that, and they counted that as a quotation. So is that something that's like widespread that scholars tend to accept these references as attestation for these gospels, and is that why primarily they date them into the first century?
Yeah, and it's hilarious as well. It's hilarious for two reasons, particularly in the case of Ignatius, because that letter you mentioned to the Magnesians is not, I don't think, even genuine. So you're really starting to build your argument on sand. But let me give your listeners an example of how we go about this, because I think one of the problems with academia and scholarship is that when you read the books that us loonies write, and we sell like 300 of them, and the publishers make a loss, it's very difficult to see the process that goes on behind it, the methodology and the intricacy. So let me give you an example. So I don't know if your followers are particularly uh, well know the Book of Mormon very well, but the Book of Mormon has a really interesting sort of style where it just copies the King James version of the Bible. And it's really clear to see that. I'll give you an example. In 2 Nephi, which is a book in the Book of Mormon, it says, "Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink, that they continue until night, until wine inflames them." Now, if you type in that quote from 2nd Nephi into Google, the first quote that will come up is from the King James Bible in Isaiah 5:11. Now, there you can clearly see how one text became another, right? That Joseph Smith, when he was writing it, took that text and created it into something else. Okay, now I give you another example about how we might attest Paul. In 1 Corinthians 1:18, there's that famous phrase, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved it's the power of God. But we preach Christ crucified, a scandal to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles." Now, that has long been said to have been attested in Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians. But let me read that to you. That says, "My spirit bows down to the cross, which is scandal to those who do not believe, but to you is salvation and life eternal." Now, I presented a paper at the BNTS conference in St Andrews, Scotland, and I said to the people, the academics in the room, of which there are many good names there, that this was clearly not Ignatius having a literary dependency on Paul. Why? Well, for two reasons. One, Paul distinguishes between Jews and Gentiles, which Ignatius does not. In fact, in the three letter collection of Ignatius, he doesn't even know what Jews are. He doesn't mention them. He doesn't know who a Jew, anything about a Jew. And secondly, what the cross is and how it's to be preached. Paul makes it very clear that they preach Christ crucified. Ignatius actually never even mentions the crucifixion, only the cross. And in addition, Ignatius never mentions the resurrection, but yet Paul does all the time. So when you begin to look at the details of these things, rather than just two words that are similar, in this case, stauos and scandalon, cross and scandal, then you realise that there's no literary dependence here. If anything, the literary dependence goes the other way. It's Paul who increases the thought, widens the thought, embellishes it. Now, the counter from people who disagree with me is that, well, yeah, but look, Ignatius is just providing a small summary of his old, the apostle that he remembers. Okay, but then how do you get round the fact that he also misses the point on massively important doctrinal elements, like the resurrection not being attested? Another one is that Ignatius will say, do not release slaves under any circumstances. Well, Paul doesn't say that. He says you should release slaves if they can get their freedom. So these literary dependencies that people have been seeing for all these years are usually what people want to see. They're things that suit the narrative. And I'm not saying, because I'm not claiming to know things in some sense, but I'm not saying that it's impossible that Paul wrote before Ignatius. I think it's unlikely, but I'm not saying it's not impossible. What I am saying is that you cannot use Ignatius for your justification. I'll just give you one more example, and I think this one's even better. In 1 Corinthians 4:4, Paul says, "I am not aware of anything that's against me, but I am not in this justified. It's the Lord who judges me." Very Pauline. For anyone who knows Paul's letters, that stinks of canonical Paul. And in Ignatius Romans 5:1, which apparently again has a literary dependency to 1 Corinthians 4:4, it says, "But I am all the more instructed by their injuries, Yet am I not on this account justified? Now, Ignatius then continues to explain how he's only going to be justified by his own martyrdom, i.e., his works. No mention of the judgment of the Lord. The Lord's judgment is neither here nor there. So either Ignatius has Paul and ignores him, he doesn't have Paul, but it is written, or he doesn't have Paul because it isn't written. And of the three, I take Occam's razor that the last is probably the most likely. So that's just an indication of the symptomatic errors that I think New Testament scholars are committing on a daily basis.
Yeah, that was incredible. I mean, I agree with basically every single word. And I'd like to kind of just ask you, because you are a Roman Catholic.
Mm.
Um, I always, when I speak to Protestants, I'm always kind of perplexed by their just um, unwillingness to accept anything from antiquity, opposed to what's like canonized and codified. But do you actually like read, for example, like First Clement, or what you think is authentic from Ignatius, or the Didache? Do you implement those in your life, as well as like possible teachings that can go back to the same time period?
Well, I mean, you've caught me slightly in a slag in which I'm not sure about the dating of 1 Clement or the Didache or those either. Particularly the Didache, which seems to me to be again a document that was composed in stages that comes originally from another document and then another document, and then they're merged together and they're welded and meshed and corrupted or whatever. But to answer the point, I, I can't lie to you that I am somewhat of an anomaly among Catholics, or among just Christians generally. There are very few Catholics who think, "Oh, I've got my Sunday afternoon off. You know what I really fancy? A deep dive into the Epistle of Barnabas." They've probably never heard of the Epistle of Barnabas, right? So they're definitely not going to look into it. However, when it comes to the church as a whole, um, she has always been interested in the early church fathers. Now, that gets left slightly behind after Augustine because he sort of becomes the figurehead basically of everything pre him, and then Thomas Aquinas then gets picked up in the scholastic and Thomistic traditions, and then everything before him gets left behind. Um, and now, since Vatican II, which happened in the 1960s, again, everything before that has been sort of semi left behind. But in theory, that isn't to say that the early church fathers haven't informed and contributed to the faith that we have now. For example, lots of elements of the Mass do date back to the third, fourth, fifth centuries, and even a little bit to Justin Martyr and his writing. So um, it definitely does inform the Catholics' faith, regardless of whether they are aware of that or even aware of the text existed. For me personally, I think they are a huge part of our faith. I don't see a way in which um, Christianity can say we are going to overlook them. And I'd say that also about other parts of church history, right? I don't think you could overlook the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople and Ephesus and Chalcedon and Trent and whatever. A Catholic is incumbent on a Catholic to look at every part of Christian history and tradition to seek and let that breathe into their faith. On the flip side, though, and this is where I was at when I was a Protestant, you basically must concede, or at least this is what I had to concede when I was a Protestant. I don't want to put words in other people's mouths. That every Christian got it wrong and made a complete hash of it until about the 1500s, at which point one man and then another man and another man somehow got it right. Yeah,
You're
and
talking
I
like Erasmus and Stephanus and Beza.
well, I think Erasmus is good. I mean, Erasmus never schisms from the church. Neither does St. Thomas More, who's also critical
Mm.
of the church. And let me be clear: is that for Catholics, there's a difference between being critical and being obedient. I think Pope Francis is one of the most silly men that's ever lived. But I'm obedient because he is not the summation of the church and the deposit of faith. The figures that I'm referring to more specifically are Martin Luther, John Calvin,
Ah,
Zwingli, Cranmer, Melanchthon. These people who said, actually, Joe, what all you've done is mess it up for 1500 years. And when you think about that theologically, then you have to accept that the God that you believe in basically just went for 1500 years. I'm not interested. I'll see you guys in a bit. And this was something I just couldn't hold. I didn't think as a Protestant, and it's why when you then look back at church history, you're left with only three options really: the Orthodox, the Coptics, or the Catholics. I won't bore you with why I chose the latter, but I do think that every Catholic would be enriched greatly with a study of the early church fathers, even up to now. I mean, we've still got modern fathers of the church, uh, and I don't think that should be romanticized. Um, but yeah, it is good for us to at least know where we came from. Again, I don't know the Islamic traditions very well, and I'm probably putting my foot in my mouth. But I mean, from what I gather, you guys, uh, the guys who follow Islam, have an interest in other things outside the Quran, right? And and other early writings. So correct me if I'm wrong. And that seems to me to be a sensible thing, because if you want to see where your religion came from, which I think is imperative to knowing whether you should believe in it or not, you've got to look back at the earliest parts of the religion.
Yes, yes, absolutely. In our well, at least in Sunni Islam, traditional Sunni Islam, we place almost an equal importance upon the traditions of the Prophet and peace be upon him and his companions and how they understood it, because we believe, even if you have a text that's solid, not fluid at all, just completely static, not a single letter changing, if you don't have a way to exegete it or to understand it or place it within its context, then you'll never be able to fully manifest its teachings and to understand it. So yeah, we do definitely we have books of like jurisprudence from the second centuries. We have books of tafsir, which is like exegesis and hermeneutics, even linguistic stuff, knowing even the lineages of some of our scholars and stuff like that. So yeah, we do place a big importance on it, and I
Right,
think that's
and if you, because
fair.
if you don't, right, then what you're saying is that let's say the Quran is written and then nobody decides to write anything about it until now. Well, the question is that, well, how do you know? Or like, where's the lineage here? The thought process surely should be that the best people who can understand the text that was written are those closest to the person or the time period in which it was written. And this
Yeah.
is why, again, I understand the traditional Catholic point of view, or scholarship point of view, is that they want Luke to have been written by Luke because he knows Mary, right?
Hmm.
And he knows Paul. And they want Mark to have been written by Mark because he knows Peter. And they want Matthew and John because they were apostles. Again, that makes complete logical sense to me of why they want that. But the problem is, you can't then just uh, create the facts to suit your conclusions. But on the subject of the early church fathers, some of them are clearly genuine, and or at least there is genuine material within them, and it's our job to find out what's genuine and what's later. But nonetheless, if we want to understand what happened in the first century of Christianity, you have to read second century Christianity. Simple as that.
Yes, I agree, and that leads me to my next question, which is you spoke about the apostolic fathers, and can you just give the audience like a definition of what that constitutes, like what time period? Because when people hear apostolic, they think, you know, the Greek word apostolos, or like apostles, Jesus Christ's followers, the 72 commissioned in Acts or whatever. And how important are they both in? Because I'm a textual critic lover, textual criticism lover, so you can see by my profile picture there. We were talking about Christology yesterday, and a Christian, he brought up, of course, First Timothy 3:16. God manifest in the flesh, and actually had to pull up the collation and tell him, hey, no, no. Most of the early manuscripts say who was manifest in the flesh or whom was manifest in the flesh. But when I read my critical apparatus, you see sometimes apostolic fathers listed there, or sometimes apostolic, or what are considered to be apostolic writings, like the Didache, like the Epistle of Barnabas and whatnot, and even later on Irenaeus or Justin Martyr. So how important are the apostolic fathers in even determining some of the readings, or also just the story of Christian origins and the creeds, and how everything developed from there?
Well, first of all, let me get out of the way that it's for this sort of thing that I receive my hate mail from Christians that I'm about to say next. Um,
Okay.
uh, the phrase apostolic fathers and patristics really needs to be done away with. Seriously, I mean, it's damaging to the field because what it implies is there's a canonical period and then another period, as if to say, well, on this date, on the 24th of June, 103 AD, at noon in the after, at noon in while the sun was up, that became the apostolic father or patristic period. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So I'll give you guys the traditional sort of definition, and then we'll talk about how we can maybe solve it. So the Apostolic Fathers refers to sort of a core group of Christians, Christian letters and texts that were considered orthodox by later Christians. So Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, these sorts of figures, and they were only called the Apostolic Fathers because, like I said, they were considered Orthodox. And this term doesn't really pop up until much later, almost like 1500, 600 years later. I can't remember quite the date, but it's a long, long time in the future. And also in these sort of groups, so as well as those, you've also got the Didache, Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, Second Clement, the Epistle of the Mathetes to Diognetus, and the Martyrdom of Polycarp. Is that all of them? I think that's all of them. But this neglects the fact that there are other early Christians writing at this time who I believe are Christians. You've got people like Marcion, Apelles. You've got a little bit later Valentinus and Noetus. And these Christians are all Christians. I mean, yes, they're later deemed heretics by people like Tertullian, or Hegesippus, but they are, for all intents and purposes, Christians. And I think that's clear from Irenaeus. Irenaeus and Justin are two of the probably biggest second century writers who would probably be considered apostolic fathers as well. And they talk about Marcion not as if he was a complete schismatic, but to someone as they disagree with, particularly in the case of Irenaeus. I think Irenaeus is genuinely trying to make sense of Marcion, or he doesn't manage to, but he tries. So moving forward then in theology, in church history, we must get rid of the term for two reasons. One, for the reason that I said about, well, when does it actually begin, this apostolic, patristic, whatever you want to call it, period? But number two, and I think most importantly, as Matthias Klinghardt and Vincent have shown, and before them Bauer had shown and others, is that much of the Bible or the canon appears to be second century. Maybe in the case of the Gospels, at least post Marcion's Gospel. In the case of Paul, well, Marcionite Paul, if it's earlier than Paul, canonical Paul, that's also post Marcion too. So we then have a place where the canon is more in line chronologically with the Apostolic Fathers than it is the canonical period, in inverted commas. So then what use are these labels to us anymore? In addition to that, what about the other Gospels? The Gospel of Truth. Francis Watson's just done a really good new translation of it, which we were in massive need of. The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter. All of these other rogue Gnostic texts, where do they fit into this equation? So, although the term Apostolic Fathers or whatever can be helpful, or the apologists can be helpful, we are in much better ground just considering a period of early Christianity. And I would define that period as everything up to probably Tertullian. Because I think after Tertullian and Origen and those sorts of figures, that's when we start to get more sort of systematized commentaries on what had gone before. So, like Tertullian gives us commentaries on Marcion and other heresies, and also and then you get Origen, it gives you commentaries on John and other Old Testament texts. So that's what I would recommend for your listeners to in their mind is say, look, I have a period of early Christianity, first 200 years, and then post 200, I have some other stuff because that's when people start to comment on what's been written in the past rather than creating new material per se. That's not to say no new material is created, but more that, they were commenting on stuff that had already preceded them.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, that's again, I agree with everything there. Having kind of like covered the groundwork of what the apostolic fathers are, or what the early period of writings and traditions, I would like to kind of pick your brain on some individual examples. So I know your field of interest and your specialty is Ignatius of Antioch,
Hmm.
and whether it's the the Usher collection or the Curetonian collection or in the different recensions that they come in, can you just uh, educate us on Ignatius? Well, his importance, what we know from like his the traditions, and from what we know about the extant manuscripts, and basically the status Questionis of Ignatius today.
Yeah, gosh, what a mess. I mean, if you're going to pick any example of early Christianity that you couldn't have picked a greater one for Ignatius as being indicative of the disaster
Oh,
we find ourselves in. I mean, it really
and I'm sorry to cut you off. It's just
no.
Bart Ehrman said exactly the same thing on the blog because when I went to Larry Hurtado's blog and I spoke and it's so great to have these amazing scholars at our fingertips. I just want to let everybody know that most of the even Marcus Vincent has a blog, and you can communicate with them, talk with them basically anytime. But I spoke to him. I'm like, um, how do we know? It was pertaining to a quotation of Irenaeus of Lyons and him supposedly quoting the longer ending of Mark. And I said, how do we know? Because I checked in the archive, and the manuscripts we have for Irenaeus are very late outside of the Latin. I
Yeah.
said, how do we know that these weren't interpolated? Because he told me something about Michael Holmes and others showing that the fathers were kind of changed somewhat to conform to the Byzantine text, and there were some intentional changes here and there. I said, how do we know that they weren't tampered with? And I brought up the case of Ignatius, and he said Ignatius is the far extreme of what anyone would perceive as normative in patristic studies. There's nothing else like that in the manuscript world. Is that correct?
Sorry, just repeat that last bit again. So
Meaning that phenomena of forged letters, interpolations within his writings, it doesn't really exist outside of Ignatius's work. It's something
um
unique.
well, I think it exists in Paul.
Okay, that's true.
Just to, um but I mean, no, if we're looking at if we're looking at traditional examples, no. Um, there's never been such a unbelievably rich and complex manuscript tradition of Ignatius. So I'll try and summarize it quickly because look, one of the fatal mistakes you can ever do is ask a PhD candidate about their PhD because they'll go on forever, right? But I'll try and keep it at least succinct. Um, so the Ignatius of Antioch's epistles, we have their earliest like manuscripts of when they started talked about, at least after they were written, that is, in the 1500s, and they find three epistles to John the apostle, that is, and to Mary the Virgin, and Mary the Virgin's reply. Another one to John as well. And these are immediately just like sort of castigated by John Calvin, who says they're all nonsense, and a few others castigate them as well. But then we find 13 letters, um, which are considered genuine for a short time until some other scholars say, actually, there's a few problems with some of these, and I'm not really sure. And you mentioned Usher. He's one of the first people to really say, there's something not right entirely here. And then eventually we find so at this point we only have these letters in Latin, and then eventually we find them in Greek. And after the Greek ones are released, it becomes, although they again not 7 letters are found, right, still 13. There is a general consensus at this point that 7 of them are true. That being Polycarp's, Manaeans, Philadelphians, Romans, Trallians, Magnesians, Ephesians. And it then becomes generally accepted that Ignatius's what they call middle recension of the 7 letters are genuine. And the reason why it's called the middle recension is because there's a shortened version and a longer version of those epistles. That is until in 1845, where William Cureton publishes the first 3-letter collection of the Ignatian epistles only in Syriac. So we only have that collection in Syriac, and that only includes Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans. and again in a shorter form to when we found them in the 7 letters. So there then begins an immediate debate between Curiton, who then argues for them, and Chev Bunsen. And then J.B. Lightfoot and Theodore Zahn provide a riposte. And basically, since the publishing of Curiton's work in 1889, of Lightfoot's work in 1889, nobody has discussed it since. It's become just the opinio communis that these 7 letters in the middle recension in Greek are legitimate. You can't say boo to a goose. If anyone questions it, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, there were a couple of scholars in the meantime who did question it, but they made very little joy. But in 2019, when Marcus Vincent wrote his book, he looked at both the grammar and the vocabulary of the Ignatian epistles and also their reception. And he pointed out, only looking at words beginning with the letter alpha, that the two sets of texts had preferences, very clear preferences for different words. And so he said to me, why don't you go now and do it with every other word in the Ignatian epistles? Compare every word and see where it's used, how it's used, and how many times it's used, and see if you can notice the difference. And immediately I did. And then I went back and I looked at where these epistles were attested. And it turns out that the only ones that are attested early on, and again, I'm not the first to see this necessarily, are the 3 letters. Irenaeus mentions Romans, not by name. He doesn't say it was by Ignatius, which is weird, because if anyone's going to know Ignatius, surely it'd be Irenaeus, because he knew Polycarp apparently, and Polycarp knew Ignatius. But there we go. Polycarp mentions the letters of Ignatius, but there's argument about whether that's genuine. And then we get Origen, who also mentions the 3, as does Eusebius. So, who then has taken these 3, embellished them to create 7, embellished them again to make 13, and then embellished them again to make 17? That provides you with so many layers of complexity and reworkings. In addition to that, just to make things even worse, I also think that the 3 letters in the Syriac also contain interpolations. They are also showing signs of problem. So, in answer to the question and to Bart Ehrman, is that, yeah, I mean, you really can't pick a bigger mess, and the unpicking of this cannot just be done by looking at the 3 letters as originally thought. So my PhD primarily just looks at comparing the 3 letters and the 7 letters, their vocab, their style, their theologies. That's another big point. Their theologies differ so greatly. And I just thought that was the argument. I had to prove the 3 over the 7. That was until one day I opened Polycarp in the longer Latin recension. So Ignatius begins all of his letters in the same way. Ignatius ho kai Theophorus. Ignatius, that is the one called Theophorus. Well, this term Theophorus is very late. It's not attested to Ignatius for about 600 years after his death. And there's no clear sign that it should be a part of his vocabulary or something that he would use. So it immediately shows sign of interpolation. And so I thought, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I will reconstruct an opening to Ignatius that I think, is conjecture obviously, but that looks sensible. And I opened up the Latin recension, and what did I see? I saw Polycarp, which said, the letter from Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch. Now, that to me sounds like a much more reasonable introduction. And then I looked at the rest of the Latin collection, hoping that they would all say Ignatius qui et Episcopos of Smyrna, or of Antioch, sorry. But they didn't. They went back to Ignatius qui et Theophorus. So somewhere, somehow, only in the letter to Polycarp and only in the longer Latin recension do we find a different opening to all of the other letters. How utterly strange. How utterly strange. And I think that's the genuine ending. But what that meant is, and Funk realised this before me in the early 20th century, that if we're going to reconstruct these Ignatian letters, there are several manuscript traditions here, and they all need to be looked at, even if they are the longer ones. Which, let me tell you now, was not good news to my ears, because it meant that the problem to this solution is going to be one that takes a long time to unpick.
Wow. So that thank you so much for that. So so you're saying that the ones that and this is interesting. This is like kind of similar to what like source criticism does, or internal criticism does for like the text of the New Testament, whereas Westcott and Hort had their own critical text that kind of preceded the manuscript findings by a long time, and they kind of helped to confirm them. So, are you saying that that the the letters that were found in the Syriac, and can you tell us what age those manuscripts are? They were attested. They were the only ones attested to in Origen and Irenaeus.
Yeah, so the manuscripts themselves, 5th, 6th, um, 5th, 6th, 7th, something like that century, but they were attested by Eusebius, Origen, and the Irenaeus passage. Now, the Irenaeus passage is only one phrase, so I wouldn't put all my chickens in that basket. But in the case of Origen and Eusebius, what's interesting particularly about Eusebius is that we think he had all 7 letters, it seems likely anyway, but he only references 3 of them. Isn't that funny? But he might have
Yeah,
all of them, but yet even he thinks, I'm not sure about 4 of these.
yeah, that is funny. I mean, and it's just great listening to you to break all this down. And one day, hopefully, when you're done with your scholarly trajectory, you can like start a podcast or something. Because I just feel like, honestly, you're very listenable, and we could just take notes all day. So thank you so much. And my next questions would have to do with the apostolic traditions. So, for example, we do have some things saying, for example, from Irenaeus, that Polycarp was a hearer of John. I'm not sure where the Ignatius tradition comes from, or the Petrine connection to Ignatius. Can you just like give us some background on that? Because I asked Bart Ehrman this, and he basically just kind of blew it off. He said there are a lot of traditions about Peter from like Antioch and Rome and even Alexandria. But what can you tell us about that?
Well, in the case of whether he knew Peter, I think it was Theodora who claimed that St. Peter left instructions about sort of Ignatius, sorry, about having episcopal see in Antioch, um, and then Ignatius becomes that. But I don't believe that it was necessary that he knew Peter. That I don't think that tradition arises. The tradition does arise that he knew John as well, and there's one tradition that's a mad tradition. I mean, I struggle to keep myself composed. There's one tradition that says that the little boy in Mark that sits on Jesus' knee. Well, that's
Yeah.
Ignatius. No, I mean, yes. Um, I actually don't spend a lot of my time researching these traditions for the very fact that most of them pop up well into like the sometimes even up to Agapius, 10th, 11th century sort of stuff. And the martyrdom of Ignatius as well, with which we only have one manuscript, the Codex Colbertinus of the 10th century. Again, loads of other traditions is there. But I think, and this is the most important tradition of Ignatius, I don't think the martyrdom's true. I don't think the story's true. I think that the whole thing is complete fiction, or at the very least, is not the way it's been told to us. And this is the tradition that really matters, because any other traditions about him being the son, the boy on the knee, or Peter, or as what another tradition says, I think it's Socrates, not the Christian Socrates, not obviously the philosopher, says that he was the first one to introduce singing into liturgy because he had a vision of the angels singing in heaven. Again, more madness. But the question of his tradition, full stop, I think is a problem. Let me put it to your listeners like this. What we're saying is that a low level bishop was arrested in Antioch. He was then transported by 10 soldiers, presumably on his own, because no other word of is made of other prisoners from Antioch all the way to Rome, just to be sacrificed to fed to the lions. And on that journey, we're told that these 10 soldiers are like leopards, and they're horrible, really horrible old boys, and all the rest of it. And although they're horrible, they let the Ephesians come in and talk to him and write letters. And after he writes letters, he's allowed to send them away to all the other churches and spread his Christian propaganda, for which apparently he's being persecuted for. Look, come on. I mean,
I
how
never
can we
thought about
think
that, honestly.
possibly?
I've never thought about that.
Yeah. And now uh, we're spending the money to pay 10 soldiers and the transport to go from east to west. In addition to that, the story that we're told about his journey from Neapolis to Troas, and he goes through Smyrna and all these places, it's a mad journey. It's a nonsense journey geographically. You would never take that trip. So the biggest question is, I think, about the traditions of Ignatius is where the bloody hell did it start that he was killed? In addition to that, I mean, not to mention that no one can agree about when he died. I mean, Eusebius says 108, but then even proponents of Ignatius now say 140. Alan Brent says 135, Barnes says 140, Purvo says 135 to 140. So no one even knows, even if they think his dates are true. So what I think is going on here is that we have some genuine material from Ignatius. And when he dies, in an effort to promulgate it and create the cult martyrdom narrative, they're embellished. I wouldn't be surprised if he was killed for being a Christian, but the whole sort of journey and all the rest of it, as Alan Brent writes in his, I can't remember what year it was, maybe 2005 book, Ignatius of Antioch on the Second Sophistic, seems to be the playing out of the imperial court, sort of the Greek cultic procession narratives. That's what the letter seems to be trying to do, to place him in that sort of Second Sophistic place. Again, something that's not present in the 3 letters, I should add. Now, in the 3 letters, we have no idea where he was arrested. We have no idea what his journey was. Now it seems like it could make a lot more sense, because let's say he was, near Rome. Well, then it would make sense that he was taken to Rome. We also get no mention that loads of people sent letters for him on his behalf. Again, this makes sense. Well, maybe in Ignatius Romans we get a little bit of that, but nonetheless. So that's the bigger question: is what's this tradition of his death and his martyrdom and his narrative? Because anything else that's added to that, like him and Polycarp were friends of the disciple John, or that he created liturgy, or that he did something else, this, that, and the other, they're only there to further perpetuate the narrative, to aid the circulation of his letters. But I would just finish with that of, okay, we've looked at the tradition of Ignatius, but what legacy does he leave behind? And this I find even more staggering than the question itself, because when we get to the later councils, and pick any council you want, they like to look at these texts from the first 200 years. They like to go back at them, and they like to see what Christian doctrine was, what Christian practice was, etc. One Clement in particular, Didache, loved, always. Ignatius, overlooked. Never commented upon. Nobody's interested. Nobody ever uses him as justification for doing anything. And that to me also seems exceptionally odd. Now, it might be because in the 3 letters, his theology is both narrow and shallow, by which I mean he doesn't talk a lot about in-depth thoughts, and the in-depth thoughts he talks about, there aren't a lot of them. But even so, to not mention anything about his Christology or his belief in the what we'd later call transubstantiation does seem rather strange to me, even in the 3 letters. And lastly, on that point, I think that the legacy that even after he wasn't quoted or used as references by later councils or later scholars, to then have 7 more letters created again seems strange. I understand why more letters of Paul are written, like Paul's letters to Seneca, because Paul becomes famous, but Ignatius doesn't. So why are we then forging more letters? Utterly odd.
Yeah, that is an excellent question because if there were, controversies, and he was such, he, like you said, he had this procession and this like kind of homecoming where he's, being paraded as this, I guess this symbolic martyr for Christianity. Why aren't they using his writings to because in the long recension at least there are places where he calls Jesus God, which are changed to like Son of God, or removed entirely in the shorter recension and the middle recension. So yeah, it is very striking. And what do you say? Is that the same for you know I kind of get them confused all the time, like the Ignatian martyrdom and the martyrdom of Polycarp. So is that generally what you feel about Polycarp, is where he's like, well, you can tell us about that too, because I love that story, and I've heard people say that it's similar to what's found in like Lucian of Samosata, or one of them is, I'm not sure, like what's Peregrinus Proteus. Can you
Yeah,
comment a
that's
little about that?
yeah. So Lucian, oh goodness me, right? So Lucian is a satire extraordinaire. Basically, he loves taking the mick, as we would say in England, and he writes a story about a guy called Peregrinus, and it's weird because he has a very similar story to Ignatius, except the ending. So look, Peregrinus is born and he is a murderer. I think he kills his father, and eventually he comes across the Christians, and he becomes quite prominent. At least so we're told by Lucian. He becomes the leader of a synagogue, which is an interesting phrase. Um, he also writes and comments upon Christian um, Christian texts. He also writes more Christian texts. He's called a lawgiver. He's called a protector. These sorts of titles, which I think uh, clearly show that he was a well-to-do sort of fella. But it all goes wrong. Lucian goes off and becomes a Stoic, and eventually he ends up committing suicide. Now, many scholars have seen the link between Peregrinus and Ignatius, and I see it too. I am not saying that it didn't happen, but what I am saying is that when it comes to the Lucian story, there are some things that I don't think we can trust about what he's saying as being genuinely Ignatian, right? So again, with all things, if you want to make a mockery of something, I think of I don't know if any of your followers have seen Sacha Baron Cohen's film The Dictator, of which he essentially tries to make a mockery of um, Islamic dictatorships in the East, right? And you watch it, and none of it's true, right? I mean, it's all nonsense. But what he does in a very subtle way is take a few little pieces here and there and grossly exaggerate and accentuate the features of it, so that at least it might sort of fall in. It could at least be recognised as from the Arab world. Lucian does the same here. He's not a historian. He's someone who's trying to write a bit of a piss take, and so I don't think we can trust him on everything. For example, I don't think he was leader of a synagogue. Right? I think that's Lucian
Right.
not getting his facts right. He thinks he's a Jew. He can't tell the difference between Jews and Christians. So he clearly hasn't done that much diligent research. And the translations in the Syriac and the Latin both show that. They use the words like congregation. They don't see a Jewish titling there at all. Which Parvu in his 2008 book, he still sees the Jewish connection, even though that the other letters don't do it. He's also clearly not a lawgiver, Ignatius, in that sense, and there's no proof that he commented on other early Christian texts. So, we can't trust him. But nonetheless, I do think that he has based his story off him. So that's another legacy that Ignatius leaves very early on in his travels. In the case of the martyrdom of Polycarp, that is a very short and quite easy to read text. I think it's only got 22 21, 2 chapters, something like that, and even those are only like 3 or 4 verses each. Um, I think that there is more credit perhaps to be given to Polycarp's than Ignatius' martyrdom. Partly because, again, it's better attested as far as I'm aware, but also because there's nothing utterly incredulous in it. I mean, unlike Ignatius about, like I said to you, these 10 soldiers, east to west, blah, 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 blah. There's nothing incredulous in it. Sort of there's a Phrygian called Quintus, and he wants to have him killed or something along those lines, and eventually Polycarp ends up at his death. It's not something I'm expert in, but from what I gather, there doesn't seem to be too crazy in it, unlike Ignatius. So, which again, if I don't see any reason to doubt, I tend not to. But again, that is not. You'd have to do your own research, I think.
Okay, okay. Because I remember something about like the was it Ignatius or Polycarp about being burned and the flames not reaching his skin and then his blood putting out the fires and then the dove. Is that genuine from the Polycarp
Is
letters
that from
or is
Polycarp? Joe, I confess ignorance.
that okay? Okay, 'cause
I confess I
I get
confess
them
ignorance.
confused all the time. I get them confused
It
all the time. Or it might be something later that I'm conflating with the original martyrdom.
no, I mean no, forgive me. Yeah, forgive me. I don't know.
No, it's all good. I might be just mentioning something completely apocryphal. But okay, so now that we've touched on basically the main two, I just because our time is running short and I don't want to hold you too long, we could do this all day. Again, thank you so much. But so when I read these texts, so I've read First Clement, I've read Second Clement, I've read the Didache, I have it open up right now, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Epistle to Diognetus, like you mentioned, and even some of the early apologies like Aristides and Quadratus and the writings of Justin Martyr. They do seem, and I think this is the the conclusion of Peterson and others who say that at the core of all of these is what's called like the kerygma or like the oral sayings or the logia that Papias speaks about, possibly that
Mm,
Jesus' teachings originally circulated in some form of disembodied form, like Jason Bedon puts it, and certain communities interpreted it differently, and you had different traditions kind of being used by different denominations. So you have, for example, like the first commentaries that we know of are from like Ptolemy and Heracli and people who are called Gnostics today. And then you have the Ebionites and the Jewish community or like the Judaized community or whatever, using something like Matthew. You have people in Rome using something like Mark or whatever, but they're just free floating traditions that they're using as a supplement to the Jewish texts. And then later on, possibly as a response to Marcion and other attacks or not attacks, but like other schisms or controversies, they were composed into writing form. Is that generally how you think that the New Testament came about, or is it like in a different direction?
good. I feel back on home ground now, away from Polycarp's martyrdom.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Let me get passionate again. So, I, it is clear that, to my mind, that the systematization of the Gospels is only in response to Marcion having one. Now, I don't agree with Vincent. I agree with Matthias Klinghardt that Marcion didn't write the Gospel. I think he's a collator and an inheritor,
I
and he
agree.
got that material from someone else. I don't know who it was. Couldn't tell you. But the question about Papias is the key question here, because Papias claims to have the sayings of the Lord. Now, we don't have that text today. I will begin a brief tangent just quickly to show you why you shouldn't trust scholars. I just claimed to you that I didn't know something. I did that because I didn't know it. Most scholars don't do that. They blag. Now, as an example of Papias of Heliopolis, I'm sure all of your listeners will be familiar with Adolf von Harnack. Couldn't name
Uh,
a bigger patristic man in the 20th century.
yeah.
This shows you how much people have read. Adolf von Harnack claims to have seen Papias' work. Not many people will tell you that.
Right, right. I forgot who
Because,
mentioned that, but yeah, go ahead. This is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, not many. I couldn't believe it. Yeah, I mean, I really, really couldn't believe it. Adolf von Harnack says that in 1916 or 1915, sorry, that's absolute rubbish. Excuse me, got my dates wrong. In 1912 or 1913, he saw in Poland the works of Papias of Heliopolis. Now, he didn't have time to make a note. Blast you, Adolf von Harnack. Blast you. But he says he saw them. And in addition to that, he then goes back to try and find them. But World War One kicks off, and the library in Poland is moved to Vienna. When he goes to Vienna after World War One is finished, 1918, they're not there. He can't find them. Now, obviously, it would be a great find for us to see if it is genuine. Again, he didn't know if it was genuine. He thought it was. What was in it? But I strongly believe that what's going to be in it is something akin to the Gospel of Thomas. A series of, or less so though, a series of sayings of Jesus that some of them that are in canonical scriptures, some of them won't be. We have from other attestations, including Ignatius, them saying things like, and as the Lord said, but that word that the Lord said is not in the Gospels. They didn't make these traditions up. I think they genuinely inherited them. And so that's what we begin with, are these logoi, words, sayings, teachings, unsystematized, not particularly useful for new Christians to be able to read. And then, after Ignatius, Marcion publishes his first New Testament, and again, I hope if your listeners don't already know this, that the first person to ever use the term New Testament and publish a New Testament was Marcion. His Gospel and the 10 letters of Paul he believed to be genuine, not the same as the canonical form. I then think in response to that, Justin and Irenaeus in particular say, we cannot have this guy. And even if we think, as I do, that they didn't regard him as a massive heretic, in the case of Irenaeus anyway, I'm not sure what Justin thought, they still would have wanted their own text, their own way to argue against him, their own sources, material. And at that point, I think that's when we get Mark. And perhaps Luke. And then later, Matthew and John. I could be convinced differently of the ordering. I'm not close-minded to that at all. But what I am reasonably close to is, particularly in the case of Luke, that it wasn't just an interpolation of Marcion's gospel. Now, what was in that logoi, I can tell you a little. Not a lot, but a little. I had a debate with Dr. Carrier and about the existence of Jesus. And the only thing that the early Christians are absolutely convinced of is that Christ was crucified. They've got no evidence for anything else. His birth narrative, not a lot about his ministry and the chronology of that ministry, of appointing apostles, to performing miracles, walking on water, feeding the 5,000, etc. And then he dies. And they know that bit. That's the bit they all agree on. And then they get confused again. Resurrection? Nobody knows. Funny business about women being there. Then one woman being there. Then no women seeing Jesus at the resurrection. They just see an angel. Is it one angel or two angels, depending on whether you use Matthew or Luke, respectively? So you see the problem then. And then you can see where the witnesses start to not corroborate the evidence. But one thing they do know is that he's crucified. Now, therefore, what can we say about the rest of the logoi? Well, the little sayings of Jesus, and I mean like shorter ones like Thomas recounts, are probably the ones that we're best in line of saying that he said them. Particularly like maybe one or two of the I am sayings, for example. I mean, I think they're then created a lot more by John and made a big deal out of. But I would strongly believe that at least one of the I am sayings came from Jesus, and that's when they made more of them. I would also think that we could discount a few things. For example, it's very clear that Jesus never said that he was the Huios to Anthropou, the Son of Man. That's pretty clear. He might have said Huios to Theou, Son of God, but he definitely never said Son of Man. We can also discount the fact that that he was, for example, the story about uh, um, some of the Ascension stuff as being part of the original Logoi. It's not entirely clear that they've got that from anywhere else but like Luke Acts. So again, this is going to take a long time for scholarship to work out. One, because they're so bloody minded and arrogant that they think they don't need to do this, and two, because even if tomorrow we all decided that this was the case, I cannot tell you the difficulty that's going to come with working this out unless we actually find more material. Not impossible, but without finding Papias himself, it will be tough. But like I say, I do believe in the Logoi. I think that's the earliest form of Christian sayings, and that's the earliest tradition that of the first century. Sayings of Jesus. Jesus was crucified. Barring that, early Christians don't know too much.
That's yeah. I mean, if we could find the what is it, the Curacan Logion, it would be amazing. I mean, it could be like a Morton Smith type of find one day in some kind of monastery or something, but that would be
If we found Papias, it would be the biggest finding in the history of biblical scholarship. And I really mean that. Forget Nag
eat
Hammadi.
your heart out somehow.
Forget Qumran. Yeah, I mean, you'll be relegated. I mean, that's it for you. Because it would show definitively whether Marcus, Matthias Klinghardt, myself, this new wave of scholarship, whether we're right. That it would prove it. Now, I'd be, and it's a win-win for me. From a Christian point of view, it's a win-win, right? But uh, uh, it would just be, yeah, it would just answer every question basically.
Yeah, and you might never take me serious. I don't know if you take me seriously at this point, but like, I kind of agree with Hippolytus on Marcion being more like proto Mark than being like proto Luke. I'm not done yet, like comparing all the different parallels that Marcus gives, because it's all in Greek at the end of the book, and I still have to sit down with a lexicon and look at all the similarities. But I honestly do think that with Mark's general attitude towards the disciples and the different like redactions that you see here and there, I think either it is extremely Pauline in the way that it kind of operates. For example, you have and when you speak about the resurrection, there's this very interesting part at the end of Luke, at the end of Mark, where it says that he went to anoint the body of Jesus on the third day. You know, when he's supposed to already have been resurrected. And in Matthew and I believe in Luke as well, uh, it removes the mention of anointing his body, and then when in Mark when they get there, the women get there, they're just spooked because they couldn't find him, and the individual tells them, "Oh, you're looking for Jesus the Nazarene. He has risen." In Mark, but then in Matthew and in Luke, I believe as well, it says. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene. He has been resurrected, just like he told you before. Now they're supposed to have known, previously, and they're not afraid anymore. Whereas in the Gospel of Mark, it ends abruptly. And the Petrine confession being different, I just think there's something there about Mark and Marcion. Even the name is similar. So John Mark or Marcion or whatever. So yeah, this might be something that nobody takes seriously, but hopefully one day we can flesh that out.
Again, I mean, I'm still on the Luke train. I can't lie to you, I'm still on the Luke train. But again, I could be convinced of the Markan train. Um, Again, for anyone to make any, if any scholar that your listeners or yourself hears that makes any truly definitive comment at this stage is making something up, because we really have not done the work here. We really haven't. And even if one book claims it has, let me tell you, it has.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. I think it was Jason Bedon and others who say that it's just the first century is kind of like a mist that we have to to kind of find our way through and try our best to reconstruct these things. And even Marcionite's reconstruction is not exactly certain because you are going through like heresiological sources and whatnot. But it's just a beautiful science. I love this conversation. I love learning more. about something so impactful, that Islam and Christianity being connected in so many ways. Um, these findings, this research that you're doing doesn't just impact Christians and their worldviews, but us potentially as well. So I see you guys as like really like honored beings, honestly. Knowing the languages, doing this work for us is just incredible, and just having translations available so we can make choices and learn where to take our lives in which direction, and make reasonable educated choices when it comes to theology and our belief in God as well. So and we're approaching the like actually we've gone over an hour. I don't want to hold you too long. I could definitely do this all day, but I
Well,
just
I
want
would
to
just say I just want to say one thing there actually about just about you said about languages. Yeah. Um, I'm sure that many of your listeners are Arabic speakers, or at least I hope they are, because that's really cool. And I wish I knew Arabic. But when it comes to biblical literature, and to a lesser extent, patristicky apostolic bits and bobs, um, you really are at the mercy of translators. When you open that Bible, and you actually, I think you alluded to it earlier. When you open that Bible and you read even the RSV, which is the translation I'd recommend to anyone who wants to study it, um, you are at the mercy of someone making choices. Now, I'm not saying they make them maliciously, and I think that I couldn't do a better job. But when you read the Greek, then you see what the intended author, what they meant, and you can see better what the similarities and differences are between them and other texts. Learn Greek if you want to get involved in the business.
yeah, I agree. And being to my Arab audience as well, like being Arabic and English speakers as well, you're kind of like in a good position because Greek. If you take a look at the alphabet, I've been studying it for a few months, and like the syntax and not Koine Greek, just like standard Greek. It's very very similar to modern day English, not in that sense, but the suffixes, the root words, you'll be kind of familiar. You're not going into completely dark territory. And with Arabic, and Hebrew being sister languages, I think Arabic speakers would do really well to start learning these, and you're probably at more advantageous position than people
Oh yeah,
otherwise.
absolutely. So being born in England, there's a famous joke that if someone that's trilingual speaks three languages, someone that's bilingual speaks two, and somebody who speaks one language is probably English or American.
Right.
Um, and so I actually came to learn Greek, and I found it quite difficult. But then I came to learn Syriac, and obviously as Arabic speakers, you'll probably have more again another sort of a leg up on me on this front. My goodness, what an absolute nightmare it was to learn Syriac. I mean, not to mention just the pronunciation. I mean, I still can't speak very well. I'm all blech. But yeah, learn languages. They're the key to unlocking all of these questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and on my bucket list is reading Truth in Translation by Jason Bidon. Well, I heard really good things
Mm,
about that book.
I second that.
Thank you. Well, again, I really, really appreciate you coming here today. I've learned so much. This room is going to be on replay, so anyone who's interested in listening to it again, going into the rabbit holes of all the things that were discussed, reading the literature, familiarizing yourself with it. Yeah, feel free. And Mr. Jack, do you have any works, any projects, any organizations or anything that you would like to promote while you're here?
Yeah, come follow me on Twitter um, at Jack Bull, and Bull has four L's because Twitter handles. Um, come follow me on Twitter. In terms of work, I've got loads of like stuff out for review at the moment, but because I'm trying to complete my PhD in only 2 years or 2 years and 3 months, something stupid like that, I haven't had a lot of time to do other stuff. So I've had loads of people saying, "Oh, when are you going to do a blog? When are you going to do a podcast? When are you going to do a video thing?" Blah blah blah. Look, I'm getting married in 6 months. I need to get my life together and be a grown up. I can't
No,
just
the
sit in my
blog
doom.
first. Blog comes first.
Blog comes first. Okay. Uh, I mean, I'm sure she'll love me. But yeah, go over and follow me on Twitter. Twitter's a really important medium because again, another behind the scenes view. When scholars go to publishers, unless they're thank you to I can't read the Arabic, but Ibn Saleh's already just followed me. You're a legend. Um, that one of the things that they look behind is your social media following, and if your social media following isn't big enough, so I know a great guy called Dr. Daryl Hannah, not the actress, um, and they said, well, we're not going to do your book because you haven't got enough Twitter followers or YouTube followers, whatever. So
Oh my God.
go over and follow me on Twitter. It'll really help you out.
Okay, okay, awesome. And I have a friend. His name is Paul Williams. He has a channel called. Well, we'll talk about this in the emails, but he has like I don't know, like 500,000 followers. He would love to have you on the program. He's had Bar Ehrman and uh Barton and many other like top scholars on there. He would be ecstatic to have you on that program.
Oh, great. That sounds brilliant.
Inshallah, yeah, it's called Black Theology. You can check it out. Very neutral, very scholarly. He's like an archive himself, so you'd be right at home. But yeah,
Yeah, man. Drop me a line. Drop me a line. That'd be great.
okay, God willing. Thank you so much. Again, I can't thank you enough for, this is just a very humble like, interfaith channel. Hopefully, we want to grow it. We want to make it more endearing and more uh, like neutral for everybody involved. What is that term? Inclusive or whatnot. So again, thank you. If ever in the future we can organize something like this again, get into maybe like some bigger reads of your scholarship, and because you really 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 know how to communicate these things, and we really appreciate it. But yeah, other than that, if you want to have any final words or concluding remarks, I think it's time to let you go about your life.
No, thanks so much. You're very gracious, and thank you anyone who sat and listened to my ramblings. It does mean a lot. Again, more bit, just one more second of behind the scenes. We put a lot of work into these things, and most scholars don't do it just for pure intrigue. But I want to do it because I want other people to know cool things because I appreciate they haven't got the time to do it. So it's a pleasure to have you listen to me, and yeah, thanks very much.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. And it's a Islamic custom. The Prophet, peace be upon him, we believe he had said that he is not from my nation. He who does not have mercy upon our young, nor shows preference to our old, nor knows the right and the status of our scholars or of the scholar. And it's really you really open the door for everything for us. So thank you again, and thank you to everyone here for attending. Spread the word for future Dr. Jack Bull's Twitter. Hopefully, we'll be seeing more of him soon. And thank you so much, everyone else. God bless you all.